Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for coming here today. Now, as is tradition in Australia, I would like to begin my presentation with a welcome to land, or a welcome to country, as we call it in Australia. So I would like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute is located, to its people, their elders both past and present. So today I'll be talking to you about Aboriginal affairs in Australia and the relationship between the original inhabitants of the Australian continent and the Australian government through its different permutations and combinations up until modern day. Now, I grew up in the town of Orange in the state of New South Wales in Australia. Now, New South Wales is the official government name to the state in which I lived. However, it is also known as the Wiradjuri country, and that is because it is the land where the Wiradjuri people lived. They have lived there for many centuries, even many millennia before the arrival of Europeans, and they are still there today. Obviously, here in Europe, I am fully aware that not many people would know much about Australian history. And when I talk of Australian history, I'm not going back to the arrival of the British first settlers in 1788. I mean Australian history, going way back to the first arrival of people onto the land of Australia, before it was known as Australia. In fact, according to various historians and various archaeologists, there are different dates that we can put on the first arrival of people onto the land of Australia. When I was in high school, the date or the figure that was given to us was some 35,000 years ago. Recent findings in recent archaeological digs have shown that there are traces of human presence on Australian soil that go back some 65,000 years. So they have been on that land for a long time. It's undeniable. According to the theory, the way people migrated first out of Africa to Australia was via the Arabian Peninsula, then through India, then down through Myanmar. Obviously, I'm using modern day names here. Through Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. And then there are 2 points into which they came into Australia, either through Timor-Leste into the Northern Territory, or going even further east through Papua New Guinea into Queensland, and then travelling further south throughout Australia. And most of the early Aboriginals lived along the eastern coast, which is quite interesting because that is now where you find the largest section of a modern Australian population. In fact, roughly 80% of all Australians live in that eastern strip. Then I'd like to briefly touch on the fact that while there were migratory routes coming into Australia, that led to a great diversity of different Aboriginal peoples. In fact, they broke down into some 300 different tribes, and for each tribe there is its own linguistic group, its own language. Unfortunately, with the arrival of Europeans later on, in the late 1700s, the number of tribes and the number of languages in Australia declined drastically for a number of reasons, and I'll touch on that a little later. But estimates put the Aboriginal populations at the time of the arrival of the first settlers at around anywhere between 400 and 750,000. A few very large estimates even put it at 1.25 million Aboriginals living in Australia at the time of the arrival of the first settlers. Now, obviously, you can understand that there's no official census data on this because censuses weren't necessarily carried out in many European nations for a long time, and also because These were people living in a very different way of life to what Europeans are. So these are just ballpark figures, anywhere between 400,000 and 1.25 million. There are a lot of unfounded beliefs that we have on the Aboriginal populations at the time. Some people say that they were solely desert dwellers and that they were solely hunter-gatherer populations. However, tribes have been found in areas as far south as Tasmania, which is the southernmost island of Australia, where you have very cold, wet, temperate climates. In fact, in winter you have large snowfall in these areas, and Aboriginal populations lived in these areas. And they had ways of life that were very much adapted to this world, to this climate. And yes, there are tribes that did live in deserts and did have the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but they aren't the only types of tribes that can be found. In fact, in recent historical analysis, it has been shown that while the Aboriginal tribes were semi-nomadic peoples, they did actually have a very deep understanding of agriculture. Not Western agriculture, but their own form of agriculture, of seed collection, of creating seed banks, which is where they would then use to sow and create crops for the next years. They had understanding of crop rotation before they even had a word to put on it according to European terms. They knew what it was. They had a deep understanding of forest management, something as simple as burning off a forest to reduce the undergrowth so that when a bushfire were to come through, it wouldn't be as intense. Whereas unfortunately, with European standards of forest management, where any form of fire is a complete no-no, where any spark is quickly doused, what that leads to is a build-up of forest undergrowth, which means that you have a perfect condition for intense bushfires later on. And this is something that the Australian government is only understanding now. So forest management has been poorly managed by the Europeans. Had we just looked to Aboriginal culture and understanding of the environment, we would have learnt from them. Anyway, that's just a digression. Many other arguments that are used against the Aboriginal populations for saying that they had no true culture that was set in stone, that there was no real nation, is that there was no written language. But that's because if you look at the Aboriginal culture, they had a purely oral tradition, and all of the laws that they had were actually handed down from generation to generation through the oral tradition. And in fact, this notion of law is one of the main pivotal points which has caused a lot of grief since the arrival of the first settlers. Now, I mentioned that the arrival of the first Aboriginals was about 65,000 years ago, but it was in 1770 that the English Lieutenant James Cook, claimed the east coast of Australia for the United Kingdom. So he turned up in his ship, he saw what he saw to be an empty land and said, "This is for the United Kingdom, this is now our colony." And the reason he said that he was able to do so was because of a legal notion known as terra nullius. Terra nullius is a Latin term used to say that if a land or a body of land is unoccupied, then the first person to arrive on that land can claim it. So Captain Cook said that Australia was an empty land, there was no one living there, no other nation had claimed it, therefore it was in his right to be able to do so. So he went back to England with that information, said that he had claimed the land for them, and then came back to Australia, where he set up the first colony in 1788. So while here in France you were only 1 year off your revolution, we were building our first shacks, our first outdoor toilets. We were a very basic nation back at that time. And the arrival of the first Europeans had two major impacts on the local population in those early years. Two impacts that led to drastic population decline. The first was disease, and the second was land appropriation. So I'll touch on disease first. In fact, disease had a huge impact as early as 1789, April of 1789. So only 1 year after the first arrival did disease wreak havoc within the local Aboriginal populations. Most likely, it was due to smallpox. Now you have to understand here that these are people who had never seen some of these diseases before, so their immune systems had no defences against it. So these basic diseases, smallpox isn't a basic disease, but other diseases like measles, influenza, chickenpox, they spread like wildfire throughout the local populations. And in fact, in one area just near Sydney, Sydney being the first settlement, there was a tribe that lost 70% of its people in the space of 1 year. That's just one example. But if you look at Australia as a whole, what we notice is that disease affected the coastal communities the most, and the reason for that being was that they were the most densely populated communities. Therefore, disease transmission was much easier. Those tribes living in the more arid area in the centre of Australia, they were the least affected. And that is because they were much smaller communities living in a much vaster area, so the contact between tribes occurred much less, and therefore disease could spread, wasn't as easy as to spread. The second point that I wanted to mention was land appropriation. Land appropriation led to a huge decline in the Aboriginal populations because the Europeans arrived and they only understood traditional European farming practices, agriculture, animal husbandry, crop farming. And for them, they required a European understanding of irrigation. They had no understanding of how to manage crops in this new arid land. And they also saw the local populations as being highly nomadic. So in typical European thought, they said, well, if they're nomadic, therefore they can live anywhere. So they went, they took the land, and they pushed the local populations off the land, saying that they would live elsewhere. The land was given over to European farmers for cattle grazing, sheep farming, also for the growth, for the production of crops, like basic wheat. However, in losing that land, what the Europeans didn't understand is that the Aboriginal populations also lost their identity, because the Aboriginal identity is one which is very much interlinked with land, with country. You may have noticed at the beginning of my speech that I made a recognition of country, and that is what I'm talking about here. It is because you need to recognise the land, to recognise the people, to recognise the ownership, and therefore recognise the culture. So when these people were taken off their land, they lost that culture. They lost that link to their identity. And in doing so, the entire societal structures that were in place, which were very much based on land identity, and which were very much based on the oral tradition, were broken down. And that caused confusion within tribes, and therefore they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to operate. And that led to many internal conflicts within tribes, either within a tribe or within tribes that lived near one another. So these were the two main effects, the first effects of white settlement in Australia. Now remember that figure I gave you of 450,000 to 700,000. They were the estimates of the Aboriginal population upon the arrival of the first settlers in 1788. A census was carried out by the Australian government in the early 1900s, around 1910. And according to that census, estimates put the Australian Aboriginal population at only 50,000. So you can see there's been a huge decline there. Now, unfortunately, that census data was used as justification for a whole swathe of policy that was brought in by the government. The government said the Aboriginal population is on the verge of extinction. Therefore, they need to be saved. To save them, they need to be taken out of their traditional ways and brought into the European lifestyle, because that is the only way that they are to be saved. That was the thought at the time. So what happened was, as of mid-1910, 1920, a number of laws were brought in which said that any children who were half-caste, quote unquote, they were to be taken out of their families and put into the care of European families, government institutions, or missionaries, so organisations under the church, where they were to be taught the European way of life. In light of those policies, thousands of children were taken from their families, and they were never to be given back to their families. Now, you may think that these were policies that were around just in the early 19th century and that they had a short-lived life. However, these policies were in effect and were actually acted upon up until 1967. Some children in some places of Australia were still removed from their families as late as 1970. So during that 60-year period, hundreds of thousands of children were ripped from their families, and this has become to be known in Australia as the stolen generation. Now, in European culture, in Paris, and literature, you have the lost generation. This is completely the opposite. These were children that had no choice, families that had no choice, who were broken apart. According to some estimates, there are regions of Australia where 1 out of 10 Aboriginal people were stolen from their families. There are other areas where 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were taken from their families. But because I'm going through things chronologically here, I will now touch on another major issue of Australian policy having a drastic effect on Aboriginal populations in Australia. Remember I spoke about terra nullius, this notion of an empty land. According to European law, the Aboriginal people had no claim to land ownership. Even though they were there well before the arrival of Europeans, they were ancestral lands. According to European law, there was no deed, there was no title, so therefore they couldn't claim ownership. There are a number of cases that were taken before the Australian courts through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. A number of those cases were due to local populations in the north of Australia who were petitioning against the further exploitation of their lands for mining. There was a uranium mine which was going to be further developed in the Kimberley region in the north. Local Aboriginal tribes said, no, you cannot do this because this is our ancestral homeland. You will be destroying our cultural sites, our sacred sites. You cannot do this. Unfortunately, because they had no official claim to the land, those claims were unheard. They were taken before the courts, and the courts rejected them, saying, you don't have ownership of this land, therefore you can't put a claim against these mining companies. It was only in 1992 where one of these decisions was taken to the highest court of the land in Australia, the Australian High Court. It was the case brought forward by a man named Eddie Mabo. Eddie Mabo had brought forward a case similar to the one I just described, and in a landmark decision, the High Court said that he was right, that the legal concept of terra nullius was invalid, that the entire founding of the original Australian settlement back in 1788 and the claim to land in 1770 had no legal grounds. From that point on, many changes in Australian policy have come about in favour of what we call native title. What that is saying is that traditional owners of the land, if they can prove, not by producing a legal document, by producing a piece of paper, but by proving that they have cultural attachment to the land, then they can lay claim to that land. Now, obviously, it's more a shared ownership of the land between the Aboriginal populations and, say, the farmers or the mining companies who, over the past 200 years, have bought and sold the title deeds to the land and who are now operating it. They have joint ownership. That was in the 1990s. Native title was a major issue. Then, throughout the early 2000s, another major issue was this recognition of the stolen generation. The stolen generation being those hundreds of thousands of children taken from their homes. What many people in Australia wanted at the time was for the government to admit that it was behind the stolen generations, that it was at fault. What many people wanted from the government was for the government to merely apologise. A number of governments touched on the topic, saying that while, yes, certain events did occur, the current government will not take responsibility for those actions. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, made a formal apology on behalf of the Australian government for the stolen generations. If you bear with me here, I just have two short quotes from a speech that was made before Parliament at that time. So Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said, "The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past and so moving forward with confidence to the future. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians. What many feared," and so end quote, "what many feared in the government accepting responsibility for the stolen generations was that then the Australian government would be held accountable and that they would have to pay damages. However, thanks to the wonders of legal loopholes, the Australian government found ways of avoiding any forms of claims being made against them. They managed to weasel their way out of paying fines, saying that, well, the laws at the time, they were what they were. The laws of today, however, would obviously ban such practices, and we are the government of today, therefore we cannot pay compensation. Other forms of compensation have been found, not necessarily monetary, but through government assistance in providing programs to help Aboriginal people suffering from, say, drug addiction, helping them by providing with family planning assistance, any forms of better access to education. So the government is trying to buy up for lost time. I think I could go on for many hours more about Australia, about Australian policies, and about the state of Aboriginal affairs in Australia today. However, unfortunately, I don't have much time left, so I would like to finish on just this one final point. A lot has been done in Australia over the past 20 years, past 30 years, if we go back to the 1992 Mabo decision. And while things are improving, while the way in which the Aboriginal people of Australia are included in society and how their cultures and traditions are respected and protected, there still remains a lot more that can be done and that needs to be done. And that is why I come to events like this, to be able to speak to this issue so that it can gain ground and that it can gain more, more visibility. Because unfortunately, It just hasn't had enough visibility, especially in the international scene. So thank you very much all for your attention. Wish you all the best for the rest of today's proceedings, and thank you very much for your attention.